got my production assistant here ready to make noise inappropriately.
Awesome.
I haven't told anyone. Someone might be interested. You want to know how I even stumbled upon this obscure, tiny, pecuniary topic?
Tell me.
Sam, like a couple weeks ago, was talking to Matt Leck about Literary Hangover.
I remember.
He was talking about Bacon's Rebellion, and Sam was like, "Oh, is that anything like Shay's Rebellion?" And he's like, "I don't know, maybe."
Shay, he lived out near Worcester.
Yeah, like who remembers Shay's Rebellion? It's like high school, probably, right? And Sam's like, I don't know. I mean, I think they marched into Worcester and shut down a court, and it's about all they did. So I don't think it was that significant. And when he mentioned its significance, that's when I was like, all right, you know what? I wonder if he's right about that. It sounds like the kind of thing that everyone would say, but without actually having checked themselves. So I checked, and actually, no, spoiler, it was pretty insignificant, at least militarily, but not insignificant in terms of what it said about the direction the country was going. Indeed, there was no country yet. So this had a lot to do with what that country, I think, is going to look like, because I don't know. It's the sort of history that's not usually analyzed through the lens of left and right. And I looked through Marxist.org, at least. They don't have shit to say about the tax rebellions of the 18th century. So I have shit to say.
So as far as we're concerned, it probably didn't even happen.
I mean, they mention it approvingly sometimes as like a sort of struggle against a tyrannical bourgeois state, but beyond that sort of like broad applause, there's no serious analysis or talk about like what happened, why did they do anything right, did they do anything wrong, none of that. So I don't know. I kind of wanted to talk about some of that today with you, Tims, because I don't. Well, how shall I put this? There's a myth, mostly born of the right wing, but it spreads everywhere, about the American Revolution, what it was about, what it was for, freedom, liberty, justice, that kind of thing. It was all good. And our far-sighted founding fathers set up an incredibly robust free republic that we all enjoy today, right? Now, I mean, I don't know about you, Tims, but that republic's not treating me too good.
Right. Like, well, so it's kind of well, a couple of things. First of all, I mean, it's the how long does it take them after the dust settles from the war to actually set up this purported republic? And Shay's Rebellion is a big part of why they do. And the second part is, why did they feel the need to break from Britain in particular? And I mean, the short version is that business interests in the North were being sort of suppressed by a British controlled trade.
Speaking of those British interests of the North of the country, I was struggling with like, how exactly am I going to tell the little story about what happens in Shay's Rebellion and make it like approachable and interesting in any way. And I did a lot of reading, and I watched some other historians give lectures, and I think I've pieced together a pretty simple way to understand what happened. And some of this might be news to you, Tims, because it's pretty cool. I thought. So anyway, it's always more complicated than this, but one of the things that was happening when the American War for Independence, distinct from the revolution, was being fought, is obviously you need an army. Now, one way you get an army is you put out a lot of pamphlets and patriotic call service, and that will do some of the work for you. But you are also going to need to equip, supply, and hopefully pay them, right?
Right.
And here's the thing: it's the late 18th century. Hard currency itself, gold and silver, is not that common a thing, even in the best of times, for the regular person to get their hands on. And the new nation, when it's rebelling against the mightiest empire on the earth, clearly has even less of this to go around. So generally, what happens in all the 13 colonies is everything starts getting paid for with pieces of paper. And these pieces of paper would be issued by different people, different institutions at different times for different worth, but they all basically amounted to the same thing. It was a promise by the government that this is script, but in a good way. It counts as money, and you can spend it. Now, here's the thing. As they're paying out all this script to the soldiers, which was never enough and always quickly depreciated in value due to the laws of economics I'm not going to get into, they don't have the option of holding on to them dollars, for lack of a better word to call them. They have to spend them. They have to give them to whoever will take them in exchange for food, clothing, and shelter because they need to live. And so throughout the war, this is what happened. They would be paid in the script, and the huge, vast majority of it would immediately leave their hands and go into general circulation. After a few years in general circulation, you can imagine that the only people who could afford to give gold or silver or goods and services for notes were people who were already wealthy enough to speculate in notes. And so these notes become consolidated at a much higher and higher level throughout all of the colonies, but particularly in Massachusetts. Now, one thing Massachusetts does that the rest of the colonies don't after the War for Independence is they redeem those notes at about twice the value that the other colonies are doing it. And because of this, they are facing incredibly onerous taxes to pay for all this. These taxes would take the form of usually like a hated head tax, just like in the Peasants' Revolt, where like every man over the age of 16 or whatever, you got to pay 10 pounds or whatever. And then to be a land tax too, for if you owned the minimum amount of acreage. Now, a lot of these people that are taxing happen to be the very same people who were originally paid in this script that they had to get rid of, and whose farms are all now being foreclosed upon. Others of them are veterans, but they're not landowners. They're just regular old people, mechanics, farm laborers, that kind of thing. Also fought in the Revolution. There is no work for them to do, and they're having a real hard time getting by. And then there were also some richer families who were doing a bit well, but still lived in the west part of the state and thus felt shut out of political power by this colony or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at the time. And all these groups are going to come together and say, Massachusetts sucks. It's bad. It's doing a bad job of governing us. It's not being fair with its taxes, and we're not going to stand up for it anymore. And we
just wanted to throw something in. There's this thing in economics called Gresham's law. And Gresham's law is usually summarized pretty succinctly. Bad money pushes out good money, and bad money in this particular case is the script that the army is making everybody pay with, and good money is gold and to a lesser extent silver. What happens with Massachusetts, with the farmers in Massachusetts, is they don't have any good money to be pushed out. All they have is bad money. Whereas the merchant classes in the big cities in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, they do have gold. So they can transact in script the whole time and hoard their gold. And at the end, when everything's being redeemed, they still have gold on hand. That's what the farmers don't have.
Exactly. Which wasn't even, I mean, there was a debt crisis happening in America at the time. But as we were talking offline before, just generally at this time in history, not doing business in money as we would understand it, very common. It would be incredibly possible for you to go, nearly a whole year, 4 seasons of farm work without really having to pay for anything with cash hand to hand as like we would understand it. That would be incredibly possible, and it happened all the time. It's probably a little bit off topic, but one thing that I didn't know that you told me, Tim's, was that in a lot of ways it would be fair to just say it is war itself by the state that really creates the need for currency to circulate amongst nations because it's the professionalization of armies that
Right.
really is driving this phenomenon. But
Yeah, it's the idea that up until, I mean, really until the 17th century in England with the New Model Army during the Revolution, before then, and to a really large extent after that, still, there's all armies are mercenary armies, and they expect to be paid, and they expect to be paid in gold. And so you can transact on a local level or even on a sort of subnational but larger than local level using things like barter and credit. But once you're dealing with having to pay people who might die doing the work that they're doing for you, they want real value right now, and that's why coin money, the biggest thing that it ends up being used for, is to pay mercenaries.
oh, whoops! We also have a problem in that, at this time, now that the war is over, there hasn't been really a solid peace declared with Britain. It will be several years before a treaty that is worth the piece of paper it's printed on and honored by the British in any way will be signed. So trade is difficult. And now that the war is over, no trading partner is still willing to do things on full faith and credit. They want gold and silver for what they ship to America, and the things that they have to ship to America are things that the Americans do really kind of need. They're things that can't really get by without, and they can't make themselves, so they really have no choice but to import it. And so that's going to squeeze a lot of people down the chain. Going back to the rebellion, of course, what I usually tell people, or what I try to tell people, I may have even said it before, but people don't generally grab a gun, either literally or metaphorically, that quick. Not even on the left, as much as they like to accuse us of being incredibly radical and hot-headed and violent. No, usually what happens is people gather together and they figure out something's wrong, and then they write a letter, right? What would you do? You write a letter to the representative in charge of say, hey, this is fucked up, right?
Right.
Can you please stop stealing all our farms? That kind of thing. And they also had some other cool government reforms that I will tell you about later that I thought were awesome. So anyway, they're drafting petitions or whatever, sending them to Boston, which is still the capital to this day. Boston ignores them. All right. So next step, say nonviolent resistance. Not necessarily law-abiding resistance, but nonviolent resistance. And so they would gather together in large groups, oftentimes armed or at least partially armed, in front of the court, and they would say, hey, you guys really should not hold court today. And most times the judge do something like show up and see all these men outside parading around with their guns saying, please don't hold court. We want to keep our man's farm. And say, wow, well, doesn't look like a good day for court. I think we should go. And they just wouldn't have court. And this went on sporadically for a couple years in Western Massachusetts before things really come to a head. And they come to a head with a change in governor. But I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the nature of armed rebellion and how it really is. It almost always it pops up after those other options are exhausted. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the analogy I was thinking of when you were describing it is the way that having armed people, guys, angry people marching around with rifles makes you not want to have court in the same way that today, seeing a guy with an AR-15 in your Chipotle makes you not want to have Chipotle anymore.
Yeah, it does put a different spin on it. By the way, that famous Jefferson quote about the tree of liberty requiring a bit of blood now and then, this was what he was actually talking about Shays' Rebellion, which is part of the reason. Yes, which is part of the reason why people at the time were so horrified by his comments. Even like in their replies to him, they were polite, of course, but they did not agree. And he's all the way in France, so he doesn't have any firsthand knowledge of this anyway, they say. And while I used to think Jefferson was full of shit on this, I actually kind of see where he's coming from now that I've read up a little bit about this, because in terms of Jeffersonian democracy, if it means anything good at all for anyone, these are his people, and
exactly,
they are about to get,
yeah.
but they are about to absolutely positively get owned by the state of Massachusetts. So
Well, this is
anyway,
right. This is just really quickly. This is the divide that emerges almost immediately, right? This is Jefferson representing the yeoman farmer class on the one hand, and Massachusetts, Hamilton in New York representing the mercantile class, and
yes. I mean, there is more to it than that. I'd say because you always like I tend to think the Jeffersonians don't they're not as homogenous as they like to present themselves, because the yeoman farmer is the backbone of their coalition and indeed like their whole vision for democracy in America. But it's the slaveocracy and the resulting really almost feudal power structures of the South are not that, and they are also, I think, equally Jeffersonian sort of attributes. And so like it does get a little bit complicated, but for today, as strange as it may sound, I'm going to mostly leave chattel slavery in the South aside. Not that it didn't exist, didn't affect us at all, but I feel like that story of, this is the world's oldest and best republic that we all founded through freedom. The liberal reaction to that story about how, no, this is really the twin projects of genocide and the importation of slave labor, developing a country, a republic for the white man. This reaction is absolutely needed. It's a revision that's true, but it's also incomplete, because if we're really talking about forging a free republic for white men, which is already like a horrifyingly limited goal, it ain't gonna shake out that way. And Shays' Rebellion will show what happens, what the ruling class will do if they ever try to shake it out that way.
Right.
Anyway, getting back to our narrative. So about these bills that that people are holding and the state is trying to pay out on, it may surprise people to know that in Massachusetts, about 40% of all the notes ever issued throughout the entire war were in the hands of 35 men in Massachusetts. And coincidentally speaking, these 35 men happen to be some of the 35 most powerful men in the Massachusetts state legislature.
Just by strange coincidence.
Yes, and they are indeed the ones who also voted as a legislative body to redeem the notes at roughly double the value that every other colony was redeeming them at. So from the start, this is a self-dealing, incredibly corrupt action by the ruling class to make the people who've already had to pay and fight the war to continue to pay the war debts accumulated afterwards. But I wanted to talk a little bit about John Hancock. Are you a big John Hancock fan?
Only thing I know about him is the big signature at the bottom of the.
That's all anyone knows. Man, I did read enough on it. Apparently, he is not. He was popular with the little guy at the time when he lived, but he was not. He was never a deep thinker. Even his admirers would say that. He's not a political philosopher really of any kind. He didn't write that much. So a lot of what we know about him is based on the writings of his detractors. And yet, like, I do kind of think the guy is like kind of cool. So here's what happens. John Hancock, everybody, most people would recognize his name at least. He's an incredibly wealthy man. He's from Massachusetts. In fact, I think he's technically the second wealthiest man in America after George Washington. And if if Virginia didn't exist or Washington had stayed retired, because this rebellion will be actually what convinces Washington to come out of retirement, John Hancock would have been the first president of the United States, maybe. But in any case, it was said John Hancock had two great assets as a politician: his vast wealth and his incredibly conveniently timed gout. Yeah, so here's what happens. My man John Hancock, hero of the revolution, baby. He's the governor. Everybody loves him. John Hancock, we love you. But there's a debt crisis happening, right? Now, John Hancock, I won't say he's like a super proactive governor, like a really great guy, but he refused to jail anyone for debt while he was a governor, so that was good. He also refused to really get serious about collecting all these taxes because, come on, man. I'm John Hancock. I'm trying to be popular here.
Right, and there's also the ongoing problem of the inability of getting blood from a stone.
Exactly. And so, like, as 1786, which is when all this is really going to start popping off, approaches, John Hancock, it is said that he kind of senses trouble in the western part of the state, and pressure is also mounting on him from the elite in Boston to like get off his ass and crack heads, go get their money. And John Hancock looks at this situation. He says, "Oh, damn! Y'all know what? My gout, it hurts. I gotta go."
Yeah,
and he fucking steps down. He doesn't wait for the end of his term either. He just leaves. So they have to have a new election. So they have a new election. They got him like a John Bowden, I think is how you say his name. Whatever you say this motherfucker's name. He becomes the governor, and he's one of the ones who's been on John Hancock's ass this whole time to collect his money. And he decides that he's going to get serious about all these rebels marching into courts and shutting them down or whatever. And what happens next is usually described as the forming of a militia, or the governor assembling a militia, or even more rarely, like the governor hiring a militia with the donations of the elite merchant class in Boston. But this is not really, that's not really accurate. What he really does is hires a private army is what he does. Like these guys don't work for the fucking state of Massachusetts. They work for like a commander they've been assigned, and they're all being paid in cash for like 3 months of service with donations collected from the only people who have any like real money to contribute anymore, which is the merchant class of Boston. And they send these guys out to suppress the rebellion. And like it's fucking awesome.
Basically, right?
They are exactly like the Pinkertons. I mean, they don't have the tech. That's the only difference. And they're way, way earlier. And they had to pay a good salary because there were militias called out at different points to try to stop these Shayites, or as they would be called. But even though this is called Shays Rebellion, is really not his at all. It's not a good name for it, but it's the name we have. Anyway, they'll turn out militias or whatever, and they'll call them out or whatever. And a lot of times, like, they won't even show up, or they'll show up and be like, "Hey, we're gonna defect." And so they'll be like defect or refuse to take position across the way from their brothers, in the Massachusetts. Like they wouldn't fight. Like getting them to fight was impossible. And I do think the rebels actually were in pretty strong position ideologically. There were a lot of unhappiness going around in Massachusetts, which is simultaneously, one of the richest colonies of the 13, and also like they're fucking up pretty bad in the way they govern themselves, I'd say.
Yeah, not good.
Very, very not good. In any case, one amazing idea about this that I didn't know, Tim's. This blew my mind. Maybe other people will think, like, why is he excited about this? But they, other than a reform, because they had ideas about what they really wanted. Their main thing was they wanted new paper currency to be issued. They wanted to use that paper currency to pay their tax obligations to stop the foreclosure crisis, and then leave the merchant class holding ultimately this paper, and then they can work out how it's going to be redeemed or whatever. But like that, and that was their plan to basically stop this debt crisis in the western part of the state, and all that's like pretty okay or whatever, right? But one thing that they wanted that was like way cooler, and man, I wish this shit had taken off in America because it would have been awesome. All right, so the Constitution of Massachusetts, it's just a few years old. John Adams just wrote it. It's the same Constitution Massachusetts still uses today with amendment. It's pretty fucked up. At least it was in the colonized at the time. And the word gerrymandering, I know you know this, Tim's, of course, but it comes from Massachusetts and it originates around this time. Right? So like even the Yankees who love democracy up there, they've got no problem finagling elections the way they want. And these people know that. And so one thing that they want is, one, we're going to get rid of the upper house of the Massachusetts state legislature. In other words, no Senate. And we're going to have...
Whose idea is this?
This is the rebels' idea. This is the Shayites' deal. So they want to get rid of the Senate, the state Senate. They want direct elections to the lower house, democratically run, of course, popular. And they want that body to then choose a governor for the Commonwealth. This system should sound somewhat familiar to people because it's basically how a parliament works. In other words, the chief executive for the body is chosen by a democratically elected lower legislature, as in the House of Commons choosing a prime minister. And I think it would have been super fucking awesome if they'd gotten their way and this idea had actually like taken off, and we had a tradition of selecting governors through, instead of a direct election, through popularly elected state legislatures. I don't know. I kind of like this idea. I don't know if you do, Tim's, but
yeah, I mean, it has its pros and cons. I think that like from somebody like Jefferson's position, like it doesn't respect Locke's idea of division of powers sufficiently. So you have by having the prime minister, the chief executive power emerging from the legislative power, you end up with less divided government than you would with an executive having essentially the same ranking as a monarch.
I mean, it is true that it does kind of insulate the governor in a way from democratic pressure. You can think of it that way. Although,
yeah,
the more democratic your state legislature is chosen, the less that's going to be a problem. That may be a wash. I think abolishing the upper house altogether, clearly a positive change.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that.
Like clearly that would have been good. Like if everyone had done that, and hey, we can even do it at the federal level. Like United States senators, if you're listening, I want you to know that I am all about all of you quitting. Even Bernie. Sorry, Bernie. You can be president, maybe.
We're coming for you.
If you win, I'm pulling for you. Yeah, but your Senate seat, like all of you should just quit and go home and just stop working. You suck. Everyone hates you. We'll keep a House of Representatives. It needs work, but we do need one. Anyway,
the upper chambers they're really like emblematic of the half-assed kind of reforms that liberalism is all about. Like, okay, we're going to have universal suffrage now, but we're definitely going to keep this upper house that is full of hereditary peers and wealthy people with from among the landed gentry, and they'll have veto power over everything that you do.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. Also,
it's the best thing ever.
In our version, we'll slap on just a de facto 2/3 supermajority required in the modern era, and that'll make getting any legislation passed absolutely impossible. So it's like this is why this is why upper houses suck. No need. There's one state got it right, Nebraska, I believe. They do this correctly. They have a unicameral legislature, and good on them for it.
Israel too. Israel does that too.
All right, Israel, also a great country with no flaws. You heard it here.
Right. Unicameralism made a name.
Oh my God! All right, I'm gonna get in trouble. So anyway, just to wrap up, basically what happens in the rebellion. It could have gone worse. So obviously the rebels don't win. They don't get what they want. Foreclosure crisis isn't ended. And they don't get any the constitutional reforms that they want. And also, I should add, they don't move Boston, or they don't move the capital out of Boston. And this might seem kind of like a silly thing or whatever, but I actually think it's one almost apolitical way that Massachusetts did kind of fuck this up. Because during this period, a lot of states are in the process or have already begun moving their capitals away from the eastern seaboard, but partially because like they're moving west. There's land to administer out there, which means like we need government officials and buildings and land surveyors to keep all this like all in order, and we need to write up a whole bunch of property deeds because we're really into property now. Property rights. And so like all that needs doing, and like it just kind of makes sense sometimes to move your capital, but also just to get to form a new power center that isn't completely reliant upon the merchants who are gonna like no matter what colony they're in. They're all going to be up and down the seaboard, and they're all going to have power because they're all going to control the flow of goods that you pretty much have to buy to live.
Right.
So like, that means like every time you have to buy it, they have to make money. And Massachusetts never does this. Boston's still the capital of this day. And a lot of people didn't like that at the time. I assume there are still some people out there who don't like it now. But it did have consequences for them in the western part of the state. In fact, at the end of this, I'll tell you that all of this is why the state of Massachusetts exists, or excuse me, why the state of Vermont exists at all, is because of Shays' Rebellion.
Right.
But anyway, so they hire this private militia. They go out to meet the rebels. The rebels, the details aren't too important, but basically they are sending messages between different armed militias in order to coordinate attack. Their messages are intercepted. Some misinformation then, or a miscommunication that occurs, and a group basically forms up to attack, thinking they're going to have support from their flanks when they do not. And but so basically, like, there will be not much fighting. They will all break and flee, more or less, and mostly into what is now Vermont. They will be pursued by the general. The general will claim a great victory and haul back, dozens and dozens of them. And they will all be really small time. Daniel Shay is not among them. In fact, none of the leaders of the rebels really among them at all. And a lot of historians, most of them pretty much agree that I believe it's General Lincoln, full of shit in this instance, didn't really do that much other than disperse the rebels. But at this point, like, the rebels are dispersed and in hiding, and the rebellion is more or less over. Most people will be pardoned. A few people will be sentenced to hang. Most of them will be commuted or pardoned in some way before the end. Daniel Shays himself will live to a very old age. He will drink himself to death, but it will take him like over 80 years to do it. So the state did not get him. But anyway, just to wrap up the rebellion, that is basically what happens. The governor, who is not John Hancock, who did all this, as you can imagine, not a popular guy now. Like, hey, you just fucking, what are you doing with this private army, bitch? Stop. They voted out of office. Yeah, and guess who's back? Guess who's feeling better, baby? Oh,
John Hancock?
John Hancock feeling better, man. Oh, welcome back, John Hancock. John Hancock becomes governor again, and he's the one who gets to like, oh, I'm gonna pardon all these rebels. That's what he does. So that's basically the nuts and bolts of Shays Rebellion.
Alrighty.
Don't know if there's anything interesting in that at all. I didn't think it was, and almost a little comical. Not just because John Hancock he's a fucking player, man. He's a big baller. he knows when to make his exit and his entrance. That's the best. Oh man, he's fantastic. But
very politically savvy, we would say.
He was. I mean, I'm not saying he was like a courageous or effective leader necessarily, but and also I should add that like he's a really, really rich guy. And I have my feelings on that. Tim's has his feelings on that. We're generally not fans. But in terms of how good a rich guy can you be, he was mostly the pretty good kind. I mean, he wasn't Crassus the Rich or anything like that. He was much more magnanimous and open-handed than a lot of rich people in the colonies at the time. He was still really, really wealthy, but I don't want to slag on him too bad for being a bit of an oligarch at the time, especially since also, like I said, he's not the one to really crack heads here. So anyway, more important than the rebellion itself is people watching this, specifically people outside the Commonwealth, specifically people mostly in Virginia, which will become an incredibly important state after the United States is formed, because maybe this is oversimplifying a bit, but if you take the 13 colonies as a whole at this point, Virginia and Massachusetts are absolutely two of the richest and most developed of the two colonies, and so those are the two places that are going to have to agree on whatever federal or national government is formed. And we know that this will end up breaking down between federalists and anti-federalists, and most of the anti-federalists are going to be more like Virginia-ish, and most of the federalists are going to be more Massachusetts-ish, at least not the western part of the state that we just talked about, not those people.
Right. I do have one question, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is it just a coincidence that Massachusetts and Virginia were the most powerful states, and that our first 6 presidents, every last one of them came from one of those two states?
Yeah, I mean, I would say no, it's not a coincidence. And usually when you got to boil it down, though, like who really ends up winning out in terms of like their vision and how much influence and power they wield in the resulting United States, I gotta give it to Virginia. I think I think they end up they end up getting more of what they want than Massachusetts does. And I think Shays Rebellion is a big part of the reason, because this is what causes like a lot of those people in Massachusetts to realize that they really don't have their shit together. Like they really can't do this on their own, and so they need to find common ground with the Virginians and their slavocratic vision.
Okay,
even if they really don't want to. And so I'm mostly just some of this is just speculation, and part of that's not really my fault, because frankly these men were very embarrassed by their pact with slave owners and slavery, and there's a reason it's not really labeled or mentioned in our Constitution, and it's always referred to indirectly or obliquely.
Right.
And in their letters, this is mostly the same in the commentary at the time. And I tend to think that I think this gives people from our vantage point in the present the wrong impression about it, that it wasn't necessarily the thing on everyone's mind all the time. I actually think that it was. I think it affected everything that it did. Yeah, and I think just because like you can't, the reason you can't see it is precisely because that's the case. As weird as it would sound, but I mean, I think this really this proves that like none of them, no matter how strong they are going to be able to go it alone. There are just too many problems that they're going to have to deal with, with that will make coming together basically a necessity. And then the debate will be, okay, well, what exactly will that manner of coming together be? But you'll notice in this is like, you know, in the political fights, there's no left, there's no right. And like I was talking to Tim's before about, but people should know, left and right are, I guess, about 5 years away, or so. When does the French legislature, National Assembly, first get created? I guess it's right around the corner.
Yeah, 1789.
Yeah,
1789 is yeah.
And of course, like it'll happen in France first, and then this terminology will have to spread out from there. But there is no left and right at this point, really, in the terms of the discourse of the politics they're talking about at the time, and in the coming years, and even up until today, because I still see American history largely explained and taught during this era as Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. And this, don't get me wrong, like that is how the factions were breaking it down. So like it definitely makes sense to talk about them. But I also do think it's useful, even if it might seem kind of like anachronistic, to superimpose our sort of concepts of left and right onto the past, just to see like if we can fit anyone anywhere and why. And maybe like examining those reasons is worth it. I don't know how you feel about that, but
well, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind, right? I mean, so as you mentioned, you don't really get concrete conceptions of what it means to be left wing or right wing until the French Revolution. But at the same time, you've had liberalism for 100 years by now, and that is, you know, that and you've also had, although it again is not sort of really enunciated in a clear way until Burke comments on the French Revolution, you have conservatism as the reaction against liberalism. So, I mean, those are sort of roughly left and right, but I mean, you don't have any kind of left that would be identifiable as a revolutionary left. It's at best a kind of centrist left, and it's a reformist impulse rather than a revolutionary impulse.
And I would say that like while these people, a lot of them would be considered, I think, or analogous to the working class today. Others of them were not. Others of them would be probably the equivalent of like incredibly small business owners, or even like mid-sized business owners, or even just like regular, you know, successful business owners, but in a business whose interests do not precisely align with the other economic elite of the area. I'm trying to think of like an example of this, like maybe in a town like mine, where I don't know, like say commercial stores, restaurants, stuff like this. They might have a certain view about, you know, traffic and how much they want it and how big they want the road next to them. In other words, like we want lots of it and we want a huge road because we want people to come into our store and buy our shit all the time. Whereas like there may be other interests that are also capitalist in their nature who would prefer that land to be used for something else. Maybe because it has a feature that, you know, has access to water, or it's full of valuable minerals, or maybe it's just like already zoned for residential. We want to keep it quiet, whatever. They're still like interest opposed. You see what I mean? So it's not necessarily like the right. This happens in our country too. Big tech companies and big banks don't always agree, right, on what should be done.
Right.
Like these kinds of clashes can happen. And so some of that's what's happening in the West. Some of it is a genuinely working class populist uprising, and some of it is the classic small bourgeois against the large bourgeois, I guess, as an orthodox Marxist might put it. But nobody really talked about it that way at the time, which is I want to make clear. So if it sounds like I'm talking on my ass a little bit, I kind of am, but I'm doing it on purpose because I think it's worth doing. Because believe it or not, actually these people had some decent-ish ideas, and if they'd been listened to, things would have gone a little bit better, I think. And I'll talk one more. I have one more thing about why, particularly, I think that is. But if you have anything to say, Tim.
No, just going along.
Well, I wanted to talk about property. You love property. I know you're a big property guy.
Okay.
Well, you were telling me all about property before.
What was that? What did I tell you about? What did I tell you about property before?
How much you love it, and how how important it is to freedom.
Private property. It's the cornerstone of any civilized society. It's private property, and it's the non-aggression principle. Never against anybody first.
Well, the thing is like the commentary at the time when Shays Rebellion is happening, and it can't be put down easily, will be damn near hysterical about lawlessness, anarchy, terrorism. Just it's terrible. Look at these people. They're just running roughshod over all that is good and decent and orderly about our commonwealth. Like, and they meant it too. I think you can read the letters for yourself. You look them up, but yeah, these people they're freaked out. The only thing that would have freaked them out more would have been a straight up slave rebellion, which is probably the scariest thing that could possibly happen to the ruling class in America at this time. The scariest thing they could ever imagine. Short of the British like reinvading that they just beat would be like a slave rebellion. And they were almost as scared. And you know, these people, most of them might not have been like sophisticated political philosophers necessarily, or had like a rigorous program that they wanted implemented that was really going to be revolutionary. But this idea that property and the rights of a property holder being not just existent and worth honoring, but being like paramount, absolutely top of the list, absolutely to be considered before any and all other considerations.
Right.
If they had done a bit better, this idea would have taken a hit, I think, and I really would have welcomed that, because we're still dealing with that bullshit today.
Yeah, well, you know, it's important, I think, because like I mentioned before, like Jefferson being really heavily influenced by Locke in terms of wanting to maintain divided government, but he gets like most of his political ideas from Locke, and Locke is a huge proponent of property being a like a cornerstone of a stable liberal democracy, and that's why, you know, Locke is a minimalist when it comes to the view of what government should be allowed to do and how much power it can exercise.
But I think basically enforcing property rights is basically all they do, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
And I think that sort of latching on to, or even like fetishization almost of property. First of all, I just want to point out, like, you know, a lot of that property is in humans, and I think that has a great deal to do with it. You know, it's a way for him to emphasize, hey, it's cool that I own people, without actually having to say, like, hey, what's up? I'm Thomas Jefferson. I own people, right? Like, you can just talk about property in the abstract. It's more palpable, I think.
Right. Yeah.
The other reason they latch onto that is, and this reason also has nothing to do with the truth or rigor or utility of Lockean property theory, has to do with the land that they're claiming now. That land used to have people on it. In fact, a great deal of that land that they're about to farm used to be farmland for other peoples, called Muskogee or Cherokee or eventually the Creek Nation or what have you, all the indigenous peoples of America. Now that all this land is basically free, because those people are far less numerous. In some cases, they've been totally wiped out by disease. In other cases, they've fled across the mountains. In other cases, there's a few left, and we can just push them aside. whatever, it doesn't matter. Now we have the land. All right, but now property rights really fucking important. Now that we're here to like make property of this land. It's really, 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 really fucking important. And coincidentally, you guys, we should all build a nation whose paramount value is the liberty of the property holder.
Right, exactly. But again, just by coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Just coincidentally, only because all this happens to be true. And Federalist, Anti-Federalist, Boston Merchant, Virginia Slaveocrat, don't matter. They can both agree about that, can't they? I think so. And the property rights that this privately hired militia in Massachusetts that they're going to call in to crush Daniel Shays' rebellion, I think that is of a piece with the daily brutality and suppression of the slave class in the South. I see a difference in kind and degree, but I don't really see a difference in fundamentally where they're at.
No, I don't think so either. I think you're communicating essentially the same message.
And they have their different priorities based on their provincial interests, but in the end, like, their class interests are already starting to form. A lot of leftists in America have been pretty amazed openly at the amount of class solidarity that like capitalists can show. But I think it has a really, really long history, and this is like one place that it really starts. You don't need to go back to post-Civil War labor strikes in Chicago to find the seeds of this idea that property is the most important thing. Definitely more important than this thing called labor.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
In any case, one of the people really freaked out by this is old George Washington, and I tend to think this is the sort of thing that makes for a better story, and so therefore it gets like talked of a bit. But as near as I can tell from reading the sources, this probably basically was the case. Washington is ready to hang up his sword. He doesn't really want to be in charge anymore, and he is genuinely aware of his Caesar-like potential, right? Like that there is an army. They are incredibly upset that they haven't been paid very well or enough, and that they're all being foreclosed on now, but that he is still greatly admired among them, and that if he were to step in and either use his power to try to lead them or use his power to try to disperse them, like it would have been a move that would have had some effect. Right. And he don't want to do none of that. But he gets freaked out. Basically, he gets freaked out by these people. In one thing that they try to do that I haven't talked about yet, because I say they had sort of like limited goals, and they had some ideas about reform and they wanted to stop a foreclosure crisis, and all that's true. But they did also go for the federal armory. So the equivalent of the big artillery pieces of the day, like the big firepower, like, yeah, they went to go try and take it. And I do think that their goal was to try to force the government of Massachusetts to dissolve.
To dissolve entirely, or just to stand down?
Well, it's hard for me to say because they didn't get that far. Okay. But did they want to use those weapons to leverage changes to the Massachusetts government and constitution? Yeah, they did. Does that constitute overthrowing the government? Yeah, it does. I mean, they are looking for another. I mean, they just got done overthrowing a government, though. Like not just a few years ago. So I mean, it's not as crazy as it sounds, right? But George, see, here's the thing, though. Like this thing we call the American Revolution. This is why one of the main reasons why like it ain't really a revolution at all, because like these people are hot off revolting, and in fact just did successfully revolt. The British are gone. Fuck off, guys. But now that all these taxes to pay, and now there's a new king, they even throw up liberty poles like the old days they used to, the early days of the revolution. They throw up liberty poles. They did that again. It freaked people out, and they were ready to have another revolution and set up a new commonwealth that was less shitty and would perhaps not screw with the western part of the state so much. I mean, that is an armed rebellion. Now, I tend to think that their aims were pretty fucking good by and large, and they don't actually end up wrecking a lot of havoc or killing a whole bunch of people or anything like that. So, I really have trouble condemning them too hard, because it more or less seems from my vantage point that really their crime was just opposing the government.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't so much that they were like brigands or whatever. But anyway, all this freaks out George Washington real bad, among other people, and that's why he becomes the chair of the Constitutional Convention, which is great because it means two things. One, he gets to run the thing, and so gets most of the credit. And two, he don't actually have to like contribute at all. Really? Like, I don't know if you know this, but like George Washington, there's nothing in the Constitution really that he came up with. Like nothing.
Oh, you mean in terms of contributing to the actual content?
Yeah, he Madison did all that. I think once or twice he chimed in on this question or that one, but like his job was basically to show up to the Constitutional Convention and give it legitimacy. That was that was what he was for, and then to become the first president of the United States, right? Like I don't want to slag him too hard, but I got like huge Washington fans around here, and in terms of like especially presidents from Virginia, not really our worst, but he gets freaked out, and this is really the reason he becomes the president. The other thing that happens is because all these people flee to what is now Massachusetts and cannot be captured, Alexander Hamilton, who is not a sympathizer with the rebels, basically goes to the legislature of Massachusetts and says, we really ought to just negotiate with these people, because like we can't bring them in and they won't come in, and there's a bunch of rebels hiding there, and so like let's have talks. And so they do, and that's why Vermont is a thing now, because Vermont, this place is basically is an independent republic. It's outside the Union. It's not under the Confederate the Articles of Confederation, and Massachusetts has no power to walk in there and make anyone do what they want. So
these are like the Bundy Ranchers of the of 1786.
I mean, kind of, yeah. Except they're like, I don't know, man. I think they're kind of good though. Like, I kind of wish they'd fucking won, or at least gotten some of what they wanted. So Daniel Shays, thanks for giving us Bernie Sanders. Honestly, I'm not sure he's really a direct descendant of you in any way ideologically. I will say that broadly speaking, they both really stood on the side of the little guy. Daniel Shays actually had like a pretty interesting biography. We know a couple things about him that we normally don't, because like, this happened a long time ago, and he was not an important man. So really until the rebellion, but
right.
The guy who's I looked up his full name so I could try to say it correctly and impressively. But fuck it. You know what? I'm gonna do it. Can you vamp for a second? Hang on. Talk about something interesting.
What do you talk about? Like how the inability of the federal government to impose its central power on the Shays Rebellion indicates that it was not really functioning as a government at all, because it could not meet the minimum requirements of what a government is supposed to do, which are twofold. First of all, to monopolize the legitimate use of violence within a particular geographic area, and second, to be able to extract taxes. And it failed doing both.
They sucked at both. All right, I have it now. So, just almost as a trivia fact, I'm gonna do my best. Daniel Shays was given a very fine ornamental sword by a major general himself, whose name will probably not be familiar to anyone. His name was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Rod Guibert du Mortier de Lafayette, also known as the hero of the two worlds. The Marquis de Lafayette is usually just what we call him. Yeah, he got a jewel or like a fancy ornamental sword from the General Lafayette himself during the Revolution. Had to pawn it for a few bucks to pay his debts. Very sad.
Very sad.
Like shit, dude. If his descendants had that sword today, they'd be fucking set forever. Like, oh my god. Like, it would have been an insane historical artifact. I haven't been able to track down like what happened to his sword, but it is sad that he gave it up. He never goes to jail for this. Like I said, he dies poor but old and drunk, and very disillusioned with where the country's gone, as I think a lot of people were at the time. And this is not really talked about so much, but once the ruling class makes it clear that the American Revolution is not going to be a class revolution, and one of the ways they do this is by hiring a private army to put down a tax revolt.
Right.
People realize this, and it's one reason why old Thomas Paine is like, fuck off out of here, and just becomes French for a while. Because of all the people around the time.
I'm going to France.
Yeah, his genius. The callback. Man, I remember when that show used to be relevant. But yeah, he fucks stuff out of here. And I mean, I think if I can remember right, like he's a frenetic guy, and so he's just running off everywhere. But part of the reason he leaves is because he really does feel like, all right, fuck it, I give up. You people are hopeless. You fetishize property. You won't abolish slavery. And after the war is done, the same kinds of people who always end up having to pay the taxes still pay the taxes. And so, what? I'm going to give these French people a try instead. By the way, I'm not going to bother to ever learn French. So good luck to me. Oh, shit. They want to kill me now. God damn, that's the story for the day. But that is basically
I'd be able to speak in my defense if I could speak French.
I mean, he might have just been too old, really, to learn it at that point. I don't fucking know. It is kind of amazing, though. He goes over there. He never fucking learns a lick of French. He's over there for years. He never learns a lick of French. He constantly has to have everything translated for him.
So he basically sets the precedent for all Americans in France.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, he literally. It's kind of sad because politically he's not really. If you remember the Girondins or the Britons, the people from the north of the country, they have closer ties to England. Right. So they speak more English, and so like he hangs out with them basically because they speak English, but politically they're not like they're a lot more like shit-libbed than he is. But
right.
Anyway, that basically wraps up what I wanted to say about Shays Rebellion and how it's a smallish one, but a good example of what's going to happen if we really are going to try to form a republic for everyone who's white, even if they don't have a lot of money.
Last white person.
Yeah, I mean, because I don't want to oversimplify, but there's no chattel slavery in Massachusetts at this time. The colonies are an economic unit. Slavery does affect them economically, but there are no slaves around, and there haven't been for a while. The native population has mostly been moved. Right, and so we are just talking about, I mean, even whiteness itself is still being formed, but we are talking about people that we would consider white today, all basically coming together and trying to form a commonwealth that can govern itself in an equitable way, and they're gonna have problems immediately, like big ones, with this fetishization of property, even outside the chattel slavery South.
Right.